Hello class, this is Dr. Branch. This is the second lecture on normative ethical theories. In the first video I discussed deontology. Now we will discuss virtue ethics and teleology, and the most well-known aspect of teleology is utilitarianism. So let's talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses on the nature and formation of a good person and the sort of dispositions and character traits that constitute the good person. Virtue ethics do not deny moral absolutes. Most advocates of virtue theory firmly believe in moral absolutes, but they believe that formation of character is more important than rules. So for virtue ethics, the primary question is not what should I do, but what should I be? Again, it's about character formation. This is like having your own ship that's seaworthy or playing your own instrument that's in tune. So history and variations, perhaps the most famous example of virtue ethics comes from Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics. And he advocates what we now call the golden mean. And so if you want to know what a virtue is, the virtue is the moderate position between two vices. So you might have the vice of being too rash. That means instead of showing courage, someone just does really foolish things like riding their bicycle off a steep cliff just to show that they're brave or something silly. Then on the other extreme, the other vice would be cowardice. And so in cowardice, here's someone that's afraid to try anything with any danger involved whatsoever, and they just hide in their home. So what you want is the right balance. Courage is the balance between rashness and cowardness. And so that would be the golden mean for Aristotle. Now, in Greek philosophy, there were four virtues that were advocated: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, and these eventually became known by this Latin phrase, the cardinal virtues. This comes from the word cardo, which means hinge, and so the idea is that a good life hinges on these virtues. So these virtues would have been something that pre-Christian Greek philosophers advocated. So the early church took on these ideas and added to them the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, or faith, hope, and charity, from 1 Corinthians 13. And this received, and later Roman Catholicism, quite a bit of development. So a modern example of virtue theory or values teaching is the Army values: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. All seven of these are consistent with Scripture, but what they do is they give secular people an opportunity to teach moral theory in a secular environment without quoting the Bible, which is why a lot of people like virtue theory. Virtues and rules. So how do you reconcile virtue theory with a deontological approach? Can they be reconciled? What do you do with these two? Well, there's a couple of different views. According to the correspondence view, virtues are derived from principles or rules, and that's basically Dr. Branch's approach, and so we know what virtues are by the degree to which they correspond with rules which God gives. According to the complementary view, virtues and principles or rules are equals, and this would be Scott Ray's view in your textbook. I differ somewhat. And so one of the reasons I differ is this, is imagine someone for whatever reason wanted to hire a hitman to kill Alan Branch, but out of conviction they stopped and read their Bible beforehand, and they read this passage in Exodus 20 that says, "Thou shalt not murder." Well, they may not be happy about reading that rule, but perhaps that would frustrate them enough that they would not hire the hitman to execute me. Well, they're probably not acting virtuously. Their motives aren't really that good. But what you find is the rule itself restrained their evil behavior. And so one of the things I want to stress is the rules that God gives are in fact addressed to humanity in humanity's fallen nature. That's why 8 of the 10 commandments begin with "thou shalt not." God has to tell us what not to do. Only 2 are directive: honor your father and mother, and remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. The other 8 are all "thou shalt not." So we need rules, and we know what virtue is by the degree to which these virtues correspond with the rules. Now, I believe Scott Ray is attempting to address the Euthyphro dilemma in his discussion here and why he advocates complementary view, and I appreciate that. And I certainly believe God is holy and the virtues and the rules flow from the holy God, but I favor the correspondence rule. So a few thoughts on virtue ethics Its emphasis on character development is commendable and quite helpful at several points. But we know what virtue is based on evaluating a person's actions via their conformity to rules of behavior. And I would also remind us all that Jesus Christ was virtue incarnate. Now, teleology. We've seen deontology, virtue ethics. Now, the third normative theory is teleology. In teleological systems, you address ethical matters of right and wrong based on consequences. What are the consequences or the outcomes of these acts? And the most famous form of teleology is utilitarianism. It's a subset of teleological ethics. Here's what John Stuart Mill said. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness pain in the privation of pleasure. You perhaps have heard utilitarianism also defined as the greatest good for the greatest number, which is another way of defining it from a different perspective. So let me just tell you a couple of, or three different forms of utilitarianism, not a couple, but three. Three different forms of utilitarianism, and you need to be able to differentiate between these three. Act utilitarian theories evaluate each individual act. So let's say a student is pondering the question, should I cheat on my ethics exam? And so as the student ponders the question, they think about the consequences of that specific act. What will happen if I cheat on this specific test? And then the next month they may have a calculus exam and they ponder another question. Should I cheat on my calculus exam? Well, each individual act is evaluated on its own, and a moral calculus is done on the particular act, whether it's cheating on an ethics exam this spring or in the fall. Each act is evaluated on its own. Rule utilitarian theories are different. So for a rule utilitarian, what they would say is this: okay, if I'm faced with the question, should I cheat on my ethics exam, then what one would do is in fact say, well, if there were no rule against cheating on ethics exams, what would happen? Well, it would measurements of learning would become meaningless, and education would become meaningless, and that wouldn't be good. So what about having a rule that says you shouldn't cheat on an ethics exam, or any exam really? Well, that ensures the standards of education to make sure we're all going to learn, and that promotes the greater good. So the rule utilitarian would focus on the specific rule. You should not cheat on an exam. Now, the third form is hedonistic utilitarianism, which has a lot of overlap with ethical egoism, but I try to differentiate the two. But hedonistic utilitarianism is a view that says one should always do what brings one the most pleasure, usually sensual and sexual pleasure. And so what practically in our culture, here in the United States, I realize I have some students from other cultures, so it may be different in your context, but here in the United States right now, what utilitarianism means for most people is what we might call hedonistic utilitarianism, a system of moral reflection in which one consequence supersedes all others, my personal pleasure. So I think you can see this in a song such as Bruno Mars' Locked Out of Heaven. And so this is a song that was #1 for him in 2012, and he sings, or Locked Out of Paradise, I suppose it was. And he sings about, uses Christian terms to sing about a sexual encounter. And the point is, this woman in the song only has worth to the degree that she's able to bring him sexual pleasure. And that's hedonistic utilitarianism. So critiques of utilitarianism, there are several. First of all, pleasure in and of itself is an insufficient starting point for ethics. In fact, there are many things that may feel good at the moment which are quite morally wrong. Then the next question is, how does one even measure pleasure? I suppose we could come up with some unit of pleasure called a hedon, from hedonism, and we can measure pleasure that way, but each measurement is so subjective. How could we know which one is greater than another? Which really leads to the next point. How can we predict consequences? Utilitarianism, if you notice very carefully, has a flawed view of human nature, and it assumes a bit of omniscience on our part, which is something only God has. The point is, we can't predict the consequences of our actions. We think we know what the consequences are, but we can't predict the second, third, and fourth order consequences. So imagine some man seduces a woman to sleep with him for totally self-centered purposes, and he's happy, and he thinks, well, the only consequences are she's going to be a little mad at me. But then what he doesn't see is potentially the child that comes from this, then the child that is aborted and the pain that comes from abortion, or if the child's not aborted, a child that doesn't know his or her father and wonders where the father is at, the other friends and family that grieve with her. There are all sorts of second and third and fourth order consequences. We never understand the full consequences of our sin until the final judgment. I would also say that in utilitarianism, individual people are sacrificed for the common good. And I have in mind here things like euthanasia and abortion. So abortion is advocated on utilitarian grounds that all this good comes from it for the mother, but what happens in the process is the baby is in fact killed. And then it's really difficult to define morality by one utilitarian principle. It can't be done. And what you discover is utilitarians are always bootlegging in other principles. So this indicates the entire system really fails. Let me just say a word about ethical egoism. This is very similar to hedonistic utilitarianism, but ethical egoism claims that all that is necessary and sufficient for an action to be morally right is that it maximizes one's self-interest. So to this degree, it's a bit different from hedonistic utilitarianism, because hedonistic utilitarianism typically focuses on sensual pleasure, sexual pleasure. But ethical egoism is applied many times to public policy debates, so in that degree it's a bit differently. The most famous expression of ethical egoism was by Ayn Rand in her book Atlas Shrugged, which is sort of a dystopian novel where the most intelligent people in the culture go on strike. And so she tries to advocate that the best thing for wealthy, bright, intelligent people to do is maximize their self-interest. That's ethical egoism. You can read my notes for more about that. There'll be a question about egoism on the final exam. So let's remind ourselves that the basic normative theories are deontology, virtue ethics, and teleology. The most famous form of teleology is utilitarianism. A second form is ethical egoism. You'll need to know the definitions of these on the midterm exam.